Get started in another 1 minute. Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us, both in person and virtually. You can't hear me? Can you hear me? All right. Welcome, everybody, to the 31st Annual Dana African American Lecture. This is our third DEI Grand Rounds for the year. I want to sort of give everybody a bit of a history of the Dana lecture. At a retreat many years ago, focused on the recruitment and retention of African Americans into our program and department. The recommendation was made to institute a visiting African American professorship in psychiatry so that outstanding psychiatrists and psychologists could spend time teaching us and sharing information with us. And so we are honored to have Dr. Dennis Antoine, who is a native of Washington, D.C. He's a board certified psychiatrist, as well as an addiction medicine physician. He obtained his medical degree from Howard University College of Medicine, where he and I were classmates. He then completed his psychiatry residency at the Johns Hopkins Hospital and went on to complete an NIH-sponsored addiction research fellowship at the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit at the Johns Hopkins Bayview campus. He serves as the director of the Cornerstone Clinic at Helping Up Mission Addiction Treatment Services clinics at Johns Hopkins Bayview, which houses the comprehensive addiction and pregnancy track. These programs help underserved populations with substance use disorders and co-occurring mental health conditions. So I want to welcome Dr. Antoine and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Good to have a classmate bring me in. And thanks for everyone who has made it here in person and virtually. I'm looking forward to the questions at the end, but I'm going to make sure I set a context that sets this up for a good conversation afterwards. And as the talk title points to, I want to explore the community academic partnerships that I'm part of to spark that conversation because it has centered around homeless persons with substance use disorders and is going beyond that in more recent years. So some of the objectives I had posted before I have here, but it really is to understand what is behind substance use disorders and what we call unhoused populations as well, and review some of the models of care to address these issues, and also look at what we're doing in the community in different places to address the collaborations and how to move those forward. And I start with pictures, and I use pictures throughout my talks often to describe where the context is. And this picture is actually in Baltimore in 1909. It's an actual block that still exists today. But this is what it looks like in 1909. And it all is to show that background and context can be very complex. So it's very important to understand where we're coming from in order to have a good sense of where we're fitting in now. And my background, I would say, is also complex. As my introduction showed, I've started out actually in a different space, not in community work, but at the BPRU, the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit. And I was introduced to something called abuse liability, which at its core is not the most exciting thing. Dr. Clay Camp in the background is laughing here because she and I were postdocs there. But at the time, we looked at how opioids worked on individuals. And we said, can people differentiate opioids? And it was a very tedious task for me coming from a community-based background. But I jumped in and I said, let's see what we can do with it. And we found something in that study. We looked at 23 participants who were coming in for a clinical trial, and we made sure that they all had similar substance use disorder history. So they weren't different across the board. And they all, on 2 separate days in a randomized fashion, received either 30 milligrams of oxycodone, which would knock most of us out, or placebo. And we said, hey, let's make sure we get the response that we hoped. pupils constricting, vital signs changing. Everything was the same across these 23 persons. So we said, all right, they're getting the real deal in terms of the drug or the placebo. What we found was interesting in that 39% of those individuals couldn't differentiate between 30 milligrams of oxycodone and placebo, which again is pretty astounding because that would knock most of us out. And the people who couldn't differentiate had an exaggerated subjective response to the placebo, meaning they actually liked and rated the liking score for the placebo higher than 30 milligrams of oxycodone, which again, you would not expect. And they had a lower rating of the oxycodone. So it was interesting. We scratched our heads. We said, why is this happening? We did not have an answer in that paper, but this is the paper that got me onto the faculty at Johns Hopkins. And what it has spawned is different directions, saying there are individual differences in who we have to treat. And I'm going to say that at the end. So I'm pausing on that statement now. The individual differences we started looking at, and I've been part of these studies, is looking at how food and addiction are interfacing to say, a person can have 3 packs of sugar and another person can have 3 packs of sugar, and that might taste different. And we also look at the individual genetic variability of response to opioids. And this is an ongoing study that we have right now at the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit led by Dr. Kelly Dunn. That's looking at different genes, and specific the OPRM1 gene, to see how that can change the response to an opioid. Different differences. And it's been productive there to show that polymorphisms of different genes can really lead to the phenotype and how a person expresses themselves. Now, again, very different from what this talk is about today, but important because I feel like individual differences are a huge theme to what we're talking about. And I've now drifted towards this area in my career, which is underserved populations. And this slide comes from the Health and Human Services to show what are the definitions of medically underserved populations. In this case, they speak towards, as the bottom says, racial, ethnic minority groups, rural populations, all different populations that are underserved in their area. And why did I get there? How did I get there? It's a complex reason, I would say. The biggest piece is, as Dr. Forrester pointed out in my introduction, I am from Washington, D.C., and I went to Howard University College of Medicine. Proud to be there, happy to have been there, and I saw several patients there. Within that, though, I am a Washington, D.C. native, and I include this picture here. Raise of hands for people who know who the persons are in this picture. Just want to get a sense. So this picture is of Marion Barry. Most people know the story of Marion Barry and the issues that he went through, but I use this picture because in here is Marion Barry's son, Christopher, and his wife, Effie. I was in the same class as Christopher in the 4th grade when Marion Barry was going through the struggles he was going through. And it was very interesting to see the treatment that he received as his father received the treatment that he did in the news. It was not kind. It was not indicative of the socioeconomic status that he was able to raise to and his family rose to, but it all showed that there's an individual way in which people experience this and the family experiences that. And it's important to keep that in mind. Unfortunately, Christopher has also passed away from drug use as well. So this picture to me really indicates why this is important. Not just because of the person, not just because it's underserved, but because when people get to a certain level in life, they're still vulnerable to this issue. And that's important to me. So homelessness and unhoused also is important because over the years of residency at Hopkins, I counted, I saw about 3,000 patients, at least. And within that, you can easily say that homelessness complicates the recovery trajectory. If a person comes in and they don't have a place to go after the hospitalization, it's going to be difficult to get them back on track. The literature says there are different approaches to this and how to solve that. 2 main approaches are the linear, which says, let's get the abstinence first, and then let's work on the housing. And as people could imagine, it can be a struggle to get to that point of abstinence first. So you have issues with retention. And housing first is another way of going about it, which is let's give you the house first and let's work on that. So when you look deeper at that, housing first does have some concerns. The first of which is there an adequacy of the support services to bring a person along as they have that housing? A bigger study that was done really showed that there were limitations there. And as it says, the large scale implementation of Housing First is likely to require additional investment in client support services. And I think that's shown to be true as a limitation across the board. A deeper study of that has showed that integrated care is another opportunity. When there was a systematic review done, and this is just published in November of 2023, of Housing First. Um, eh, First of all, they did a great job of doing different countries, not just the United States, but Canada, France, and Spain. But they also saw that it was really necessary to integrate substance use disorder care and mental health to have the best effect. The limitation, though, here is that there was only short follow-up, so it was really important to see what would happen over a long period of time, and there was not much cost-effectiveness data because setting up housing can be expensive, especially if there are repairs and other things for overhead. And one thing that really has sparked out, because I've had the opportunity to travel to even places like Vietnam to look at this, is that most of this stuff has been done in high-income countries. So if you think about what's been done in the US versus Vietnam, where the money might not be as available, it might not be as salient or effective or even possible to set these types of housing first options up. So the limitations are there, but it doesn't mean we should abandon it. I think it is then the opportunity to enhance that. And that speaks to where the arc starts to bend towards some of the work I'm doing now. This paper was published back in 2012 by an associate professor here at the University of Maryland, Michelle Tootin. And she explored with a team at that time abstinent contingent recovery housing and something called reinforcement based treatment following opioid detoxification. So, a different way of going about this, which was an amplification of what would happen with Housing First. So, what did they do in this case? They looked at a combination of different therapies that encompassed reinforcement-based treatment, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, also motivational interviewing, which we know fairly well in this field of moving people along the ambivalence, and creating that also in the setting of a positive environment and adding contingency management as well. And with this combination, they did see a profound effect compared to just the recovery housing alone. As you can see here, 50%, there was a 50% decrease for those individuals that had the recovery housing plus this RBT model. And then there was also a change in those compared to usual care as well. The key, though, is that at 6 months, the combination was most likely to lead to that abstinence, and the length of stay in recovery was extended for those in the combination of recovery housing and reinforcement based treatment by 49.5 days compared to just recovery housing alone. So, all to say that there are opportunities and literature that shows that we need to enhance the housing first model. There's nothing wrong with it, but there are opportunities, as I've said in different settings, to raise the bar. And I think with the issues that we see in treating these individuals, it's very important to take advantage of those opportunities to raise the bar and amplify what is offered. So again, coming back to this slide, we're back in Baltimore. We've looked at the literature. We said, okay, these are our options. What can we do with this? Well, so this block, if you look at the history of it, is on the 1000 block of East Baltimore Street, just past Shot Tower, just past a nice French bakery, if you ever make it that way as well. And it is a place where there has been a multitude of cultural changes. This building has been a Talmud, a place for teaching of Hebrew school. It's been a YMCA, different cultures, different backgrounds, religions. But eventually, what happened in the mid 80s is that it got transformed to a different institution, which now exists today, Helping Up Mission. And it's not a place that's owned by Johns Hopkins. I don't work for Helping Up Mission, but it is a place that's been around and took that whole block and turned it into housing and recovery services for homeless men. Pausing on that men because I'll change that a little bit later on. So they took this whole block and said, let's build housing on the left side. Let's build places for primary care services to come on the far right. Let's add educational services so people can get their GEDs and diplomas. And let's make sure people can stay here for up to a year. And that's where Helping Up Mission still is in this day for men on this block. Houses over 400 men even to this day through the pandemic. Multiple residential programs, takes in VA individuals and also persons who just want to stay overnight for guest services. And they have access to different services such as healthcare and dental care. Now, the key here, and this is where some of the community academic collaboration becomes bumpy at times, is that they are completely faith-based. That is their origin. That's where they start. And so they also offer a spiritual recovery program that goes with that. And that is enriching to a lot of the individuals there. They bring themselves along also as a therapeutic community, meaning individuals who live there do the cooking, the cleaning, the security, the driving. They all have a vested interest in what's going on for the individuals who stay there. And as I mentioned before, they can learn things along the way, but the goal is to make sure they have a living wage by the time they're done and they can leave and get that independence. And they're starting now to build a larger pool of peer recovery specialists that are certified in order to bring that work along. So this is a lot going on, even before I step in the door. What happened is that Helping Up Mission said, we need something a little bit more. We need something more evidence-based. And they reached out to Hopkins around 2010, right as I finished my postdoctoral fellowship, and said, hey, could you bring something on campus? Because we want something there to accompany and supplement what's going on. So after a couple of years of things I wasn't trained in medical school for, writing business plans, talking to people in places I've never been to before, actually took a clinic that was on the Bayview campus and physically moved it into that building that I showed you before. So it just moved completely. We got it accredited, and it opened up on that 2012 date, March 13th, 2012, with just one counselor at that time. And I was the medical director and helping out. Since then, we've grown to 7 counselors, clinical supervisor, 2 part-time psychiatrists, and now a physician assistant who's helping us out. And we have the capacity for 100 clients there. And we're doing substance use disorder counseling in that model of reinforcement-based treatment that I mentioned, in addition to the mental health treatment for those who may need it. About 40% of those who come in the door need it. So you would say, look, you have the proximity. You're literally 50 feet away from where they sleep. This is great. This is perfect. It did not happen that way. The first year we were there, we kept a marker of people who reached IOP level of care, which is individuals who attend substance use disorder treatment at least 9 hours of care, 9 hours a week of care. And that's what a lot of them needed. Long histories of substance use. They met the ASAM criteria for IOP. And we said, let's meet that mark. They're going to be right there. We only got 30% of people to meet that mark, 50 feet away. So we said, okay, we're going to have to close. Otherwise, this is not going to be sustainable. And that's where the academic community collaboration starts. We had to change things. We started conversations across the week, which still happen today. Daily updates on who's missing appointments, or if there are events that are happening, like the Ravens showing up the day after Christmas, which they do every year. They do. And also making sure we find ways that the mission talks to the clients about, why is this important? You're here for the recovery of your substance use, but here's an option. Can we have a conversation there? It's not required, but just make sure there's a community approach, almost like an ACT approach there. Regular updates on the activities, and then really what goes on today that's key is the weekly interdisciplinary meetings with HUM. So my counseling staff and my supervisors and myself, we sit down with sometimes the pastoral lead of the program, sometimes their CEO has sat down, their COO, and we say, hey, how is this going? What's going on? It's about to snow. On Monday, this coming up, they're closed for Veterans Day, but Hopkins is not. How do we make that happen? Things like that every week we talk about to see how can we learn in the plan, do, study, act model, for those familiar there from quality improvement, but how do we make this better? And there are also even monthly meetings to make sure we're going in the right direction with board members, mutual updates, education even about what's the difference between naloxone, buprenorphine, and methadone, to give them that level of understanding of what are we doing. And even though it's philosophically different at times, Hopkins is not a faith-based institution. How can we make that work? And this is the fruit. We started out at 30%, and then over time we got up to 80%. And I can tell you, even during the pandemic, it stayed above 80%. And no surprise that we extended treatment for those that were in our program compared to those that were not in the building. We extended treatment by 55 days. And that's in line with the literature with Michelle Tudin's work. So it speaks to a partnership, and what should a partnership be? The World Health Organization brings it along as a collaborative relationship between 2 or more parties based on trust, equality and mutual understanding. And I can tell you, the big part is involving the risks and benefits and making sure there's accountability there. If helping a mission doesn't understand the risks that I have by having a IOP percentage of 20%, then we won't be there long. And if we don't understand what's important to them value-wise in terms of faith-based and making sure that's imbued for their programming, we won't be there. They won't want us there. So that has been a big piece of this partnership. And with that, I think we have room to go, but the National Survey of Drug Use and Health has shown that this really does meet a need that's unaddressed. I've used this slide in its iterations over the years, and I'm always struck by the fact that 49% of individuals with some type of substance use disorder and mental illness don't get any treatment at all. So we're meeting that even more. And then that little sliver that shows that only 5.7% of individuals get both the substance use treatment and the mental health at the same time. We're just trying to make this work. Now, the interesting thing also is the Helping a Mission is part of over 250 missions across the country. So we're starting that conversation now of how do we bring this to those other places? Not to say that this is the right fit for everyone, but it can at least widen the surface area of that 5.7%. I think we're going in the right direction. So I could stop there, but then COVID happened, and COVID made it a lot bumpier. And I recall just walking around because everything was closed for a few days saying, hey, we need to figure out how to keep this open. So we were able to get a grant from the Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute to say we want to start telehealth to make this work because you have 400 people in a building not going anywhere except for quarantine at the Lord Baltimore Hotel. And we needed to figure out how to make that work. So we got the grant, and when IT didn't show up, I was setting up computers and televisions, and we converted to telehealth over the course of about 2 weeks. It allowed for group sessions to occur with AV monitoring, and I could sit at home, and I did the first group. So I sat at home and did the group while they were in the room sitting there in the mission. And then we had individual offices with laptops so that our practitioners could also sit in with them. And we also had tablets so that when they went to the Lord Baltimore Hotel, they could log in on the Wi-Fi and continue their care. So with that, it allowed for a continuity of care with social distancing, and it kept our clinic open. Now, the interesting thing about that, which I didn't see coming, is that we also did pretty well with telehealth. And this slide is fairly current in terms of how things went for all of Johns Hopkins medicine over that stretch of time. We haven't gotten the 2023 numbers, but I think you can see that it is showing that this is feasible and sustainable in this state. The numbers show that this can happen, but it does take a lot of infrastructure work and knowing everyone's digital fitness, as I've learned to say. And we made it easy for people to double click on a Zoom icon so they can come to me, not going through WebEx or the other platforms, but making it as simple as possible so individuals can reach us and be okay with that. Now, this happened on a good time because there's been a lot of issues with homelessness, with health disparities as well. I think it's been evidenced in this information from the National Alliance to End Homelessness that there have been a lot of discrepancies across ethnic groups, showing that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander have higher rates of homelessness than other ethnicities, though you still have American Indian and Alaska Native having high rates, also with Black individuals and other ethnicities, but to show that there have been a lot of discrepancies there. And African Americans tend to have a high amount as well, representing about 49% of homeless families with children. So not just taking into account the individual, but the families need to be taken into account as well. The other piece beyond that, beyond the individual and homelessness, and this is where my arc starts to bend a little bit more, is that there are also, I guess, COVID and health disparities in terms of overdose deaths in that framework as well. And that has shifted a lot during the pandemic to show that it has created some health disparities with Black individuals having the highest rate of overdose deaths since the pandemic. And then you see the kind of the decline in rates from there in terms of white individuals, Hispanic individuals, Black individuals, and also the other individuals as well. So a lot of health disparities for overdose deaths. And I feel like that has gotten a lot of time in the media and the press, as it should. Something that's lesser talked about is neonatal abstinence syndrome, also called NOWS, neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome. And this study I wanted to highlight because it's really where my arc starts to bend more recently. It was published in December of 2023, and it canvassed 250 counties, as it shows here, really the panhandle of where you see a lot of opioid overdose and opioid use. And what they showed, very straightforward, is that the rates of NAS went up a lot, 335% over that time. And ironically, the rates of prescriptions of buprenorphine went up even higher. That's a whole talk by itself, so I won't jump into that. But it shows that while we're talking about homelessness and while we're talking about opioid overdose deaths, there's a cycle that is also beginning that we need to think about. That cycle is amplified as well by the economic nature of the pandemic, in that a lot of places have been closing their facilities. This report, if you ever have a time to read anything administrative in hospital care, Becker's is where a lot of people go to, and it shows that 42 hospitals across the country last year were closing or ending their services. One of them that was highlighted in this article talked about a whole county in Mississippi losing their inpatient hospital completely. So this is not just about homelessness or opioids, it's a bigger picture. So in the middle of the pandemic, while other things were going on, I became director of the Center for Addiction and Pregnancy. And I had worked with some of the patients who I'd referred here, but for those who are unfamiliar with the Center for Addiction and Pregnancy, it has been around for over 3 decades now and has had a multidisciplinary focus during that time to ensure that there's care psychiatrically, for pediatric care and OBGYN care for individuals with substance use disorders that are pregnant. At the time, there was also a temporary overnight housing unit, had 16 beds, and it was in what we call the Mason F. Lord building, an old building, I'll say, almost as old as that block I showed you in 1906. So it wasn't the most pleasant place to sleep in. Let's just put it that way. And we were thinking about the women strongly because there was a lot going on. There was the NOWS or the NAS, as I mentioned, but there was also discrepancies in infant mortality and maternal mortality, in that Black individuals had much higher rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality, and we needed to keep that in mind. And so the mission of the Center for Addiction and Pregnancy was very important: to improve the perinatal outcomes of women with substance use disorders and their children through that multidisciplinary approach, but also to revive the education and the research, because I felt that with all those closings and all that context I mentioned, we were losing census. So how do you take care of that? This is the newer building, 2 blocks down from the 1909 building that I mentioned. Helping Up Mission in the beginning of 2022 opened a Women and Children Center with 250 beds, 200 for women and 50 for their children. What we did as of March of last year is we created a partnership with this space, bringing our opioid treatment program that is still on the Bayview campus in partnership with Helping Up Mission. And for the first time, Helping Up Mission, this faith-based organization, allowed methadone and buprenorphine for pregnant women while they were in their recovery program. That was not allowed before this, because there was a lot of stigma and a lot of pushback, if you want to say, for methadone and buprenorphine. But remember, we had those conversations with them. This is the difference between naltrexone and buprenorphine and methadone. And this is what happens in terms of retention if we start these medications. And this is how we prevent adverse outcomes if we start these medications. All that time since 2012 was going into this. Because when we walked in the door in 2012, we were like, where are the beds for the women? We need those because they're out there too. And in 2023, we now have that partnership. So what does that look like? It's slightly different because the Bayview campus still has to remain in operation as a regulated program. So we still do have an intensive outpatient program with substance use disorder counseling, and we have psychiatric evaluations and mental health counseling for the pregnant persons that are at home. The key there is that we are, still sticking with the obstetric and the pediatric healthcare, and the women are allowed to stay in our program now for up to 1 year postpartum. That was a difficulty prior to the pandemic because of Maryland legislature. We had to do some advocacy with some of the local politicians to say, hey, Medicaid needs to be extended further. And they did that, and that's allowed us to do a bit more. In terms of the research, we've started now to even get a little bit more going. This is a clinical trial that started about 6 months ago called the Healthy Brain and Child Development Study to see what happens to the dyad and to the child and to the neurodevelopment of this process as persons go through their recovery. And we've enrolled about 10 individuals thus far as one site. University of Maryland has another site as well, but this is something where we're now able to see where things are. Overall, we're up to about 28 women at this point. We started out at 3 in March of 2023, so that's a huge growth, and we had a maximum of 15 children in that building, I pointed out, which can get a little bit loud at times, but in a good way. As we say, it's a good problem to have. The meat of the issue, though, with this partnership, and this is where it gets interesting to me, is that someone researched this a long time ago, did it as a thesis, and they looked at Helping on Mission to say, how does this work if you have a faith-based organization doing a substance use disorder program? Is it going to push people away? Is it going to pull people in? Is it going to be self-selecting? And the thesis was very interesting at the time, done in 2008 when it was published. Some of the work was done before that. But as it says here, it showed no evidence between the level of spirituality and how long a person stayed, suggesting that Helping on Mission, is equally effective for those who are strongly devout and those who are not. And I think that's an important part because there could be a gut reaction to say, well, they're faith-based. This is not a good place. No one says that about some other places in the area. But I think the evidence is helpful here to show that it could be still receptive for people who are not that devout. And I've seen that in my practice there. We have persons who are of different faiths, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, and it works out. In addition to that, this thesis, though, pointed out something that I found very interesting, that, they say here, HUM is an explicitly Christian recovery program. Therefore, it runs the risk of alienating non-Christians and those who feel that religion and spirituality are private matters. And I've brought this to them and challenged them with that, to say that you might be creating an environment that you should be aware of, not change everything, but be aware of that you don't want to push people away. Conversely, I've also challenged Hopkins to something, to say, if we change the wording of this a little bit, we as academics need to be very important. I think this was an issue we didn't address early on in our partnership, where we could say, Johns Hopkins is explicitly an academic institution. No one would disagree with that. It runs the risk of alienating non-academics and non-clinicians and those who feel that research and clinical care are only university and hospital matters. That's the part where I think we're still working on. Peer recovery specialists are new to this space, and I think they would somehow fall into that gap sometimes. Or people who are coming from this from a spiritual standpoint and not from an academic standpoint, not with a p-value. They might fall in this gap. So in creating a partnership, I've challenged people who walk into the space on both sides to say, how do we maintain this? And how do we make sure we're not pushing each other away for the sake of the persons who are coming in for treatment with an average of 10 years of substance use? That's the average of people coming in the door. So it has been a lot of work, but you've seen some of the fruit and the potential from that. And it really is just part of the bigger model. This comes from the Department of Education's website, where they look at how to engage in the community. And this is what it comes down to. How do we maintain an inclusive environment for people that we want to work with or people who want to work with us? The personal relationships is that beginning conversation of sitting down and talking. Creating a welcoming atmosphere, making sure we're not, I don't wear my white coat, for instance, when I go to talks or go to the mission, because it's not something that's really relevant there. And it does create a little bit of an offsetting approach, an offsetting environment. Increase accessibility, telehealth, being on site, being close, developing alternate methods for engagement, again, telehealth, but also how can people reach me when they're away? I give people my direct line that I work with there. And honestly, there are a lot of folks who've never worked with a doctor before, much less a psychiatrist. So they're building new ways of engaging with healthcare, which should be the standard for them. And then, of course, building a presence within the community and partnering with diverse organizations and agencies. The community piece in the agency, I think Hopkins, I'll say that out loud, we have a different approach than University of Maryland. I think that's the best way of saying it. But I challenge Hopkins to do that a little bit more. And that's where my career has really gone towards how can we utilize this, not just to be there, but to say, can we make things better for folks? And the way I frame it now is implementation science. That is a burgeoning form of research that is happening with outcomes. And these should be outcomes that drive themselves forward, looking at implementation outcomes, and we could pick many within that first column, then also service outcomes with the efficiency, safety, efficacy, and I would say also the patient centeredness, some of which are having more tools to measure these things, and then client outcomes, whether it's satisfaction or functional symptomatology, or how long does it take until they need to go back to emergency room or something of that nature. There are different ways of looking at this, and we've started this at Helping Up Mission now by looking at sleep. The biggest thing that they're challenged by when they come in the door, we found that approximately 40% of individuals had difficulty sleeping within the first week, and still about 25% had difficulty sleeping at 6 months. So we said, let's figure out how to get them to sleep better without substances. And we've been using this cognitive behavioral therapy model for a while. And we looked at a REAIM framework, which is a quality improvement framework, to figure out how to implement this in a good way. And based off of this, we've now gotten a grant from the American Association of Sleep Medicine to make it more accessible, make it a brief behavioral therapy so that a person doesn't have to wait 2 months to be enrolled and go through all the rigmarole to get in. So how do we make it easier? How do we make it more accessible? But how do we measure it and describe it for maybe 250 other rescue missions across the country to do? That's the work that we're doing. Now, within the CAP track, accessibility is also there. We're actually paying for them to be transported back and forth. Hopkins is doing that. And it's a hybrid model, as I mentioned, with the telehealth being something where they can sit there in the building, or if they have to come up for their methadone, we drive them up for their OB appointments or their methadone, and we make that work. We're getting a lot of calls. We're starting to have the problem where we say, hey, we might not be able to do intakes because we're running out of slots. I'm okay with that problem, but we also have to challenge Hopkins to say we need more people to do this staffing. And that's a fight I'm willing to have. But all to say, I think this is very feasible and it's very needed. CAP has been around for a while for a reason. So the potential is there. We could do even more things like treatment retention, quality of life, healthcare efficacy, literacy, I should say, and then look at gender differences as well. Those two buildings now house 600 people approximately. We should know what's different, because when we first got there or tried to build the women's program, Helping Our Mission said, well, let's do the same thing for the women. I was like, that might not work. And let's do the same thing for the women that we're doing for the pregnant women. That might not work either. And so I think we're now at a point to say there's potential to look at these differences in a richer way that may not have been done before. We've also been able to write a little bit about this as well, just in a more educational sense. Bob Gaiman is the former CEO, president of Helping Up Mission, and he and I were able to write a book chapter about the importance of partnering with successful service agencies. And it was a good conversation. It started out as a sound of a verbal feedback between he and I, and it's turned into a good process to inform other persons who have gone in that direction. And the key there was about sustainability, making sure that we have shared resources. We actually were able to bring the Hopkins internet down to Helping Up Mission to make that work. That's how we keep the network security going. How do we build contracts and things to rent space in that area? And then as Hopkins grows, as academic institutions often do, how do we maintain the ability for Helping Up Mission to grow on their own, just like any partnership, and maintain that connectedness? That's a very important piece. The key I also found in these partnerships is that there have to be ambassadors to keep the engines going, because there's often going to be disagreement between persons who come in who might have a very strong spiritual stance, and they say, well, we don't think we should have any type of substance use disorder treatment in here. We have it. And that's a true story. I went through those conversations. So you have to have ambassadors at different levels, whether it's a CEO or COO or someone to say, this is important. How can we make this work? And on top of that, you have to be able to figure out how to problem solve in that mutual manner. Again, not much different than any relationship. This is just one at a bigger scale. Going in a different direction. We can do this elsewhere. We can say, hey, we need to partner with other persons in the community. And what we started during the pandemic with a colleague of mine, Dan Hale, is we started going to churches as well. to say, how can we partner with you to help? We don't want anything. We don't need money from you, but how can we do this when people are struggling? We started something called the Congregational Depression Awareness Program. Just saying, this is what depression is. Here's some resources, SAMHSA, or whether it's the 988 number that came out. How can we get you there as a community organization? There are a lot of myriads of that, but this is an opportunity to show that, again, it's feasible. People volunteered to do this. Even though they might have had different backgrounds, all of them were different persons who were in congregations, but we've now amassed 27 congregations across the Eastern Seaboard, if you will, and Mississippi. That one came out of the blue, but we got that one as well. And we asked them again, how can we make this better? That's always the key question. I'll say that over and over and over again. How can we make this better? And they said, we want information. So we got them information. We were able to get a small grant to buy into that and get more. And we're about to span out a little bit more. But the theme, again, is there. You can't just stay on the campus or stay in your office. Sometimes we have to go out and meet them where they are and then ask them, what do you want and how do we make it better? So just another proof concept there. And also testimonials from their side, not just our side. I can sit up and talk about depression all day. That's what we were trained to do. But having a pastor who's gone through depression with that lived experience is key. Again, maybe one of those persons who falls in that gap, but a very key person to inform the rest of the congregation of what might be important about seeking treatment and getting treatment and destigmatizing treatment for those who might need it. And that's a lot of what goes on in this work. So the future directions I think are interesting. So starting from the church standpoint, a lot of things are happening even over the course of the pandemic. The rate of Christianity is falling, and this graph shows from Pew Research that it may fall even further. And we shouldn't limit ourselves to one religion, of course. There are different backgrounds with religion, not with religion, that we should think about. And as I sometimes say, people go there religiously. So we should make sure that we're there where they are to meet them. Think to the future even more. I paused for a second to think about Don Quixote, who I had a spare moment to read one day. And Don Quixote, if you look at him, we always think about him with windmills and chasing things that aren't there. But when you read the full story, he was actually an academic. And he died over a stack of books, and he looked at his ideas and said, oh, that was interesting that I tried all that. But if you look at the whole book, he was an academic, but I really pause on this because what he wore on his hat was a barber's bowl. He took it and put it on his head, and that was his symbol of what was his armor during the day. The twist I made with that, personally, during the pandemic is I started something that we called Nappy Hour. And this is a barbershop that's next to University of Midtown, and it's another place in the community that I feel is untapped, in which you bring a DJ, you bring conversation about mental health, and you just sit there and talk it through. And you attract a lot of people that way as well. And you ask them, what would be helpful? What do you need? And other people are doing different versions of this in different parts of the country. So I'm not the first. I'm not taking credit for it, but it's just to show that the community is in a lot of places where we aren't necessarily tapping into. And there's an opportunity there to make that connection. The other part that's very clear is I cannot do all this forever. This is way too much. And the key now, I think, is figuring out how do we invest in the next generation for that. And the program that I am investing myself in more, and I was talking to Dr. Forster about this, was Generation Tomorrow, a program where we're expanding a pipeline of individuals who want to get into the healthcare field for the future. And we were able to publish this article a few months ago, looking at how we address stigma in these individuals that are going to these health programs in the future, and how do we address that stigma when they're working with underserved and vulnerable populations. We showed that we need a much larger sample size, first of all, to show anything statistically significant, but we were able to shift the needle. And I think that's the bigger key. We need to shift the needle and make sure that we are filling this, because one person cannot do it all. I know some people look at me like, what are you doing? Well, it's called underserved for a reason. And I recognize that. Now, my last slide I always have fun with. I love this slide. And this is the slide I use for all of my patients now, all of them. because I see mostly homeless persons, many of which have never worked with a psychiatrist. So I say, hey, number one, I say, what's your name? I want to make sure I have the right person on the screen. I always say that. Number two, I say, well, is it okay if I explain what I do as a psychiatrist? And they're like, all right. And then I ask them, do you know who Bob Ross is? Most of them say yes. It's hard when they say no, but most of them know Bob Ross. And then I tell them, well, I can't paint, which I can't, but I kind of try to do like Bob Ross. I start with a blank canvas and I'm going to paint a canvas of your life. And I'm going to try to do a good job of this, but I know I'm not going to get it very rich in 1 hour. We're going to need a lot of time, a lot of hours to do that. And eventually I say, well, you may want to focus on some of these fuzzy trees in the corner. Could be like an oxycodone or fentanyl or, substance use or trauma, which is very important. But I want to make sure I paint the whole canvas so I don't miss the mountain in the background, like the bipolar disorder or the depression or the anemia that's in the basement. So it lets them understand that I want to see the big picture because a lot of folks are used to just being pigeonholed to one place, and everyone needs a different coat on the canvas, the individual differences. The key that I've realized in the past couple years, because I have been using this framework a while now, is it also matters who's painting the picture a big amount of the time. It shouldn't always be the same person to get everything. It's possible you can get a decent picture, but it's important that the person painting the picture asks the question, am I painting this right? Am I doing it? Do I have the reflexive humility to ask that question? Now, I say that word intentionally because that is the core feature of what is now called cultural humility, not just cultural competence, but cultural humility to make sure we're painting this properly. I realize that there may be a lot of individuals who would not go to a faith-based organization, and it's not a good fit for them, and that's good. I realize we need to build a swath of other services to make sure we get all the people the things that they need. But in the meantime, there are a lot of Bob Rosses out there who don't know it. And there are a lot of people who should probably ask the question more, am I doing this right? How can I do it better? What am I missing? And take the time to do it over and over and over again. So I'll stop there. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and happy to take any questions. Yes, sir. Yep.
Thank you. I just had a question about first of all, I think it's awesome you're doing this partnership with successful community organizations. That really resonates with me. And one thing that I've found in trying to do that kind of work is that I often you seem really good at being able to figure out kind of what you're missing and work with people and listen to that and also be assertive when you feel like you've got something that maybe they're missing, like buprenorphine. And I often find myself not knowing where I stand. Like if when they push back, I'm like, am I missing something here? Or is this a moment when I need to kind of be like, why don't you try this? And we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and you're talking about at a individual to individual level or programmatic, that because there are two different approaches there, of course.
I'd love to hear, but I guess personally, just given my personal experience, I'm thinking of talking. I'm a psychologist talking to community clinicians in these clinics where I'm working on implementing something, for that clinic and maybe getting pushback about what's going to work here, that kind of thing.
Well,
I don't often know if they're right or if I'm right or kind of how you think about that.
yeah, that's a good question. They're always right. No, and I joke about it, but this is a partnership. You never go into any partnership saying, I'm right. You never. I don't think that's going to work. So it's a conversation of what do they need? And ask them, do they need this? And you can say, in the Bob Ross style, and I'll probably keep Bob Ross up here for a lot of the questions. You can say in the Bob Ross style, look, I'm trying to paint this picture to help you with buprenorphine, but I'm not sure if this is going to be easy to put out there. What are the barriers that you see? Is this something that's helpful? Have you tried it before? And I think those types of conversations from a qualitative standpoint usually help soothe things out. For us, it took, I would say, from 2012 it took about 7 years to have that conversation. And I'll frankly say we lost a lot of patients for the ultimate reason in that process. So talking them through their frustrations and their struggles probably would help say, how your study or your process would fit in. Because a lot of these places are used to a 5-year study at best with an R01 that disappears and they never get seen again. And that's frustrating. That just adds to what they're going on. So if you are able to have that conversation and say, here's who I am outside of the study, and then eventually, work with them and say, well, I have this idea. Would it be helpful? That's how with those 6 stages, starting with stage one, that those just barbershop types, if you will, that's probably a good way to start. Patient level, I usually start out with asking them, what do you want out of this session? Because if they tell me I don't want medications, like, well, I'm going to give you the menu. I respect your choice. But I want to give you the menu just so you're aware, and I'm happy to talk about it more later. That motivational, I won't say enhancement, but motivational approach, giving them that opportunity. And I think resisting the writing reflex is going to be very appropriate in both levels. Mhm. I see someone standing in the back. No? Yeah, maybe. No. All good.
Guess to piggyback on that question, I wonder if you've had experience of sort of going into some of these community organizations to set up a program, but knowing that you may only be there for 5 years or may only be there, and how to set up a program that then can continue to run on its own.
Yeah, so I think the best experience I've had with that would be the church program. And it's a question of who will carry the baton. So we've called them now, I think we're calling them ambassadors. We may be using another term, but the concept that I know I said briefly, but is important there is we ask people to apply for the program, and that gets us interest. And then we ask them to say, would you be able to commit to a few things? One, would you commit to getting a letter from your congregation leader to say that they're okay with this information being brought to the program or brought to the congregation? And then we also ask that they set up a program of their own when things are done to propagate the knowledge. So I think that's part of the key there, because I have been a part of processes where we've gone to primary care offices and done stuff and it's over and we're gone. But eh, who will carry the baton is the key. And with certain topics, it's easier. Like just talking about depression is okay, but I wouldn't make them the person who would be manning the 1-800 number for the church 24/7. It has to be sustainable for them. And so that we've done that mostly free so far. But you could see a grant coming out of that because of the 4 or 5 years that we spent building that knowledge, with the understanding that we have the expectation up front to do it. Other people have seen me and said, all right, you're going to be our psychiatrist tomorrow. I'm like, no, I can't. That's a limitation. So setting that expectation up front, I feel is helpful. Just like the other gentleman brought up, you want to know, can they do it up front as well? Otherwise, it's not worth setting things up. Yeah, yeah, no problem. Got one up here.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had anything on the wish list for
Oh,
bring more parent programs and center.
yeah. Daycare. Number one, people to hold the babies when the women are in their group, so they don't have to worry about what's going on with the baby. Parenting classes would definitely be up there, and that's something we're building towards. But the practicalities are it is hard to take care of a baby and be in a 9-hour-a-week program. So how to make that easier? Daycare, absolutely. And there are a lot of I've learned a lot of layers to how to build one that's sustainable and financially sustainable. And then volunteers if possible to do that. The easier part is getting diapers, getting strollers, things of that nature. Helping a Mission does a tremendous job of that, and 85% of their budget is philanthropy. So they got that part. But clinically, how do you take care of the babies? How do you make sure they're well? And a dream would be, we're just talking about 0 to age 1 right now. Could it be up to age 18 right now? No, because teenagers are a bit difficult. But how, getting to that level would be great, where you could really have a longitudinal space. But then I can't make that vision on my own. Helping a Mission needs to say, is this what we want? So the easy answer is daycare. Outside of that, any volunteers that you know, feel free to reach out and I can connect you there for sure.
Buy-in from Hopkins in the early, in like 2012 to move their clinic from the helping up mission.
Yeah. So how do we get by? So I'll be upfront. I didn't do the buy-in. So that's to move the clinic was not me. There were a lot of mutual persons on both sides of the pond, people who are at higher up levels at helping a mission, people on higher up sides of Johns Hopkins who said, we think this can work, but we need to give it a try. The only way that it would even work is if we moved it. There was no way it could actually work on campus. It was the HSCRC and where the building was, there was just a lot of politics with that building that it had to move. So that was done. And even a clinic that happened in our old postdoc space had to close down because of some of those politics. So there's just a lot of Maryland carve out issues that were occurring there. So that part we had to do. But in terms of the buy-in to keep it going, I think we had to spend long nights to get that 30% up to 80%. Quickly. And once we showed that, it was pretty easy. Because with that, I think comes the sustainability that most places would be okay with. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Dennis.
Hey.
So we completed a postdoc together and it's just, I haven't caught up on your work, sadly, for a few years, but I'm just so blown away. So looking forward to talking soon. I'm going to go to the other end of the age spectrum, and this is something I want to flag for you. I'm certain you know about it, but the opioid overdose rates in Maryland in particular, in Baltimore, are highest, and these are fatal for adults 55 and over.
Yeah.
And disproportionately older Black males
Mhm.
in Baltimore, and I've been tracking the data, those data. I'm curious, do you know of any programs going on related to that and ways to get involved?
Yeah. That's a great question. Great question. It is the next epidemic, I think, the fifth or sixth wave, if you will, of this whole thing. The short answer is there isn't one program doing it. The biggest thing that I can say is happening is that as of next month, maybe this month, Medicare is beginning to reimburse IOP for substance use disorders in hospital-based programs. So that's a whole financial talk that we can talk about, but there are a lot of spaces, including addiction treatment services at Bayview, that are thinking, how do we make this work? What we have been doing even prior to that is addiction treatment services on the 6th floor of our building. On the 1st floor of our building is a space called Elder Plus. And they work with individuals. I see a couple nods, so that's good. They work very closely with individuals above the age of 65, usually, to make sure they have transportation, medical daycare, checking out medications, a great wraparound team. And they've noticed for years that these individuals have substance use disorder issues. So where have they been referring most of their patients to? The 6th floor. And so that's the type of programming that we've worked on to build a close connection with a good geriatric provider. And I think that's going to be the base of the model. But I'd say over the next year or so, people are really going to start wrapping their heads around the Medicare IOP reimbursement. And if it ever gets to community space, that would be good, non-hospital based space. But Medicare is very hospital oriented, very physician oriented. So it might take some time to expand even further.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you again to Dr. Antoine for an amazing talk. I also want to just mention that we are offering CEUs for this session, and there's a link posted in the chat. And I also want to acknowledge the Social Justice Education Subcommittee of our Diversity Committee, as well as specifically Dr. Kozak, who reached out to Dr. Antoine and have really shepherded these 3 DEI grand rounds for this academic year. So thanks again. And then Dr. Antoine's available for an extended Q&A after this for anybody who has time to stay and kind of have a more intimate Q&A session. So thanks, everybody.